At a quiet corner table, a millionaire single dad watched in stunned silence as the waitress knelt beside his non-verbal son, patiently coaxing out sounds no therapist ever could. She didn't know who he was, but he knew in that moment she was unlike anyone he'd met. What he did after witnessing that scene would not only upend her life, it would uncover a truth neither of them saw coming. Rain poured down hard, pounding against the windows of a small diner in town. Inside, the flickering fluorescent lights cast a dim glow over a nearly empty glass of wine. Only a few stragglers were sipping their coffee, watching the fierce storm through the glass. Stephen Brooks pushed open the door. The bell above jingled weakly. He led his 5-year-old son, Oliver, inside. Water dripped from his long coat as he brought his 5-year-old son, Oliver, into the diner. The boy tightly gripped his hand, his wide eyes anxiously scanning the noisy, unfamiliar place. "Come on!" Oh, the waitress behind the counter called out loudly, her warm voice startling Oliver. Stephen nodded slightly and led Oliver to a booth near the window. He helped the boy sit down and took a seat across from him. Oliver immediately began to sway slightly, mumbling under his breath, his small hands clapping once. Then again, Stephen leaned forward and spoke gently. "It's okay, buddy. Just breathe. We'll get out of here soon." The clatter of dishes in the kitchen startled Oliver. Then loud laughter from a nearby table made him jump again. He let out a sharp cry, bolted out of the booth, and fell to the floor. He flailed his arms and began to fall to the ground, overwhelmed and inconsolable. Stephen moved immediately, trying to lift him up, murmuring comforting words that barely worked amid the chaos. Before he could pick Oliver up, a figure jumped down beside them. It was a young woman wearing a stained apron, her tired ponytail swaying, but her face calm, and her movements slow and deliberate. "Hey there," she said softly, pulling a laminated card from her pocket and holding it up, showing a cartoon smiling face with the word "breathe." Oliver froze, staring at the card. His frantic movements slowed. The woman placed her hand on her chest. She took a deep breath and exhaled, touching the picture again, smiling gently. Oliver mimicked her, taking a shaky breath. Stephen stood frozen, watching his son calm enough to sit up. The little boy's body trembled but was no longer completely overwhelmed. The woman, whose name tag read Hannah, smiled at Oliver and handed him a soft rubber toy from her apron pocket. Stephen's shock hardened into anger. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked. Hannah looked up, startled. "I was just..." she began. "You're not allowed to touch my son without permission," Stephen shouted, his voice echoing through the diner. Everyone turned back. "I'm trying to help," Hannah said, frowning. He was overwhelmed. "I've seen that before. You probably think you'll rush in and play the hero. Pity the poor little artist boy and his incompetent father." "Right." Stephen's voice was sharp and brittle, carrying something deeper than anger. Hannah's cheeks flushed pink. She slowly stood up, the card still in her hand. "I'm not pitying him," she said evenly. "And I'm not pitying you. I'm just trying to speak his language when you can't." Stephen's fists clenched tightly at his sides. "You think you know anything about him? About us?" He paused. "I understand enough to see a scared boy," Hannah said softly, "and a father too angry to see past his own pride." Her words hit like a slap. Stephen opened his mouth to retort but stopped himself. Oliver, still sitting on the floor, looked up at him, eyes wide, silent. Hannah knelt down again, ignoring Stephen, and gently said to Oliver, "You did really well, sweetie," she said, "really brave." Oliver cautiously reached out for the rubber toy lying nearby. He grabbed it and hugged it close to his chest. Stephen swallowed hard, feeling the judging eyes of other diners closing in around him. "Get up," he said to Oliver, voice rough. Oliver obeyed, sliding back into the booth with the toy tightly held in one hand. Stephen tossed a crumpled bill on the table and turned toward the door. Hannah watched them leave, her heart aching. She had seen that before disappointment, helplessness hidden beneath anger. She knew it all too well because she had been there herself. She blinked quickly, fighting back tears. Stephen pushed open the door into the screaming night, barely noticing the rain pouring down on him as he led Oliver back to the car. Inside the diner, whispers inside the diner. The whispers of conversations resumed, but the tension remained. Hannah picked up the laminated photo card from the floor and wiped it clean with the corner of her apron. "The poor kid," she whispered. She glanced again toward the door, but they were gone. She never expected to see them again. She certainly didn't realize that this brief, heartbreaking encounter would be the start of everything she'd ever dreamed of and everything she'd ever feared. The rain stopped the next afternoon, leaving slick streets sparkling under the weak winter sun. Stephen Brooks sat behind the wheel of his black SUV, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he waited for the light to change. Oliver sat quietly in the back seat, softly humming a tune without a melody. Stephen stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, but his mind was miles away. He couldn't get that diner encounter out of his head. Hannah's words echoed it in his mind, sharper than he wanted to admit. A father too angry to see past his own pride. He hated how close she had come to the truth. He spent the whole night convincing himself he was right to yell at her, that no stranger had the right to step into his son's world without his permission. But deep down, an uncomfortable guilt took root, growing with each passing hour. Oliver had calmed down because of her. Oliver had smiled at her. That fact was harder to swallow than any wounded pride. The light turned green, and Stephen slowly drove forward. As they passed the diner, he caught movement in the rear-view mirror. Oliver had turned around in his seat, pressing his small hand against the window, looking back at the familiar red sign. Every time they passed this place, Stephen frowned. This wasn't the first time. Every time they passed this place, Oliver's attention went to it as if hoping to catch a glimpse of something or someone. Stephen shook his head and kept driving. Life went on in the usual quiet chaos. At home, the afternoon unfolded in the usual quiet chaos. Oliver stacked blocks into carefully color-coded towers. Stephen answered emails, paced the kitchen, making fruitless attempts at conversation. But the image of Oliver's face, lighting up that small spark of hope, wouldn't leave him alone. That night, as Stephen tucked Oliver into bed, he found a small napkin in his son's hand, a crude, childlike drawing stick figures, a smiling woman with messy ponytail hair, and a boy standing beside her. Hannah and Oliver. Stephen plopped down on the edge of the bed. "You like her, don't you, buddy?" he said softly. Oliver didn't reply with words, of course, but his face said it all. His smile was small, shy, but genuine. Stephen felt something tighten deep in his chest. It had been months, no, years since Oliver had shown that kind of spontaneous joy with someone new. Stephen stroked Oliver's soft hair, his throat tightening. Maybe he'd been too harsh. Maybe Hannah had seen something in Oliver that even he had overlooked. The next day, as they drove into town, Stephen watched Oliver carefully. Sure enough, as they passed the diner, Oliver leaned against the window, eyes scanning the parking lot with a quiet longing. Stephen tightened his grip on the wheel. He didn't want to admit it. He didn't want to need help. He didn't want anyone, especially people he barely knew, stepping into the fragile, carefully controlled world he'd built for his son. But he couldn't deny the truth. Hannah had made an impression, not just on Oliver, but on him too. He exhaled, slowly. He drove down another street, away from the diner. His heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't ready to face her. Not ready. Not ready while he could still hear the echo of his own angry voice ringing through that small diner, cutting off the one person who had reached out with pure kindness. He needed to think. He needed to be sure. But in the back seat, Oliver gently tapped his small hands on the window, humming softly, a smile stretching the corners of his mouth. And Stephen realized, with sinking inevitability, that this wasn't about him. It was about Oliver. It always was about Oliver. And maybe, just maybe, the boy deserved a chance to chase that. A tiny, fragile hope, even if Stephen himself feared what it might cost. Days stretched on, and the weight of guilt bore down on Stephen Brooks' shoulders. Every night, he watched Oliver curl further inward, his energy fading like a spark about to go out. The boy who once stacked blocks and danced to cartoons now sat dazed by the window, staring out as if waiting for someone who would never come. Stephen had tried everything he could think of. Trips to the park, new toys, bringing favorite foods. Nothing worked. Oliver's smiles grew rarer, his humming softer, almost sad. It gnawed at Stephen worse than any sleepless night. One cold Saturday morning, Stephen watched from the kitchen doorway as Oliver sat cross-legged on the living room rug, clutching a worn napkin with stick figure drawings. His tiny thumb traced the picture back and forth, his lips forming silent whispers. Stephen knew what he had to do. He hated it. He hated how it made him feel like a failed father, a failed protector, but Oliver was drifting away. And if he didn't act, he'd lose him completely. Stephen grabbed his coat, his mind racing with the excuses he would tell himself later. This is for Oliver, not for Hannah. This has nothing to do with her. The diner bell jingled as he pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coffee and bacon. A few regulars glanced up, then quickly went back to their meals. Hannah stood behind the counter, wiping the coffee machine, her ponytail swinging as she worked. At first, she didn't notice him. Stephen hesitated, his pride clashing fiercely with his despair. Then he cleared his throat. Hannah looked up, her body tensing the moment she saw him. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. Stephen swallowed hard. "Can we talk?" he asked again, voice low. Hannah's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded toward an empty booth. Stephen slid into the seat, feeling awkward and out of place. Hannah stood across from him, arms crossed defensively. "I'm not here to fight," Stephen said quickly. "Good," Hannah replied coldly, "because I have no energy for that." Stephen forced himself to meet her gaze. "My son," he began, then stopped, searching for the right words. "Oh, he hasn't been the same since that night." Hannah's face softened a little. "He misses you," Stephen said. "He looks for you every time we drive past here. He draws you. There's something that lights up in his eyes when he sees your brown hair. He breathes out hard. He draws you." Something flickered in Hannah's eyes. Something gentle but cautious. "I was wrong," Stephen admitted. The words scraped against his pride like sandpaper. "About you. About what you're trying to do." Hannah said nothing, waiting. "I'm asking," Stephen said slowly, "if you could spend some time with him one afternoon. No strings. Just meet him." Hannah blinked, clearly caught off guard. "You want me to babysit?" she asked, half in disbelief. "No," Stephen said quickly. "No, just be there. Talk to him like you used to." Hannah hesitated, her heart pounding. She should say no. Every instinct told her to stay away. She had her own troubles, her own fragile world barely holding together. She didn't have room for a wealthy man with a broken heart and a bigger ego. But then she thought of Oliver's face, how his small hands fumbled with the picture card, the hesitant smile he gave her, and she remembered the feeling of being needed, even in the smallest way. "I don't know," Hannah started, voice uncertain. "Please," Stephen said, his hoarse voice making them both jump. Hannah glanced toward the kitchen, where her boss was yelling about a broken frying pan, then to the window where rain was about to fall again, and to the future she had long stopped believing in. She looked back at Stephen. He wasn't begging. He wasn't commanding. He was just a father asking for help, shedding every layer of armor he usually wore. When she asked softly, Stephen exhaled, relief clear on his face. "Tomorrow afternoon at my place." Hannah bit her lip. "Okay," she finally said, "but only for a few hours." Stephen nodded. "Thank you." As he stood to leave, he hesitated. "And Hannah," he said. She looked up. "I'm sorry for what I said." She gave a tired, small smile. She said, "Just do better." Stephen bowed his head and left without another word. Hannah watched him go, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't explain. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned back to the counter, pretending her world hadn't tilted even a little on its axis. But inside her mind, a small voice whispered, "Maybe. Just maybe. This is the start of something different." Sunday afternoon arrived, bathed in hesitant sunlight. Stephen stood by the living room window, arms crossed, staring out at the driveway with tension rising in his chest. Oliver sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully lining up a row of toy cars. Every few seconds, he glanced toward the front door. Stephen checked his watch again. Hannah was supposed to be here 10 minutes ago. He began to wonder if she'd changed her mind when an old, small car rolled into the driveway. Stephen exhaled slowly and walked to the door. Hannah stepped out, a canvas tote bag slung over one shoulder. She wore jeans and a light blue sweater. Her hair was loosely tied back. She looked out of place here, but somehow fitting like a splash of real life contrasting with the carefully controlled muted tones of his world. Stephen opened the door before she could knock. "Hi," Hannah said, slightly breathless. "Hi," Stephen replied stiffly, stepping aside to let her in. "Hey there," Hannah said warmly, bending down to his level. She pulled a small laminated card from her bag, on which two hands formed a sign. "This means you," she said, signing as she spoke. Oliver watched her for a moment, then slowly and awkwardly copied the gesture. Stephen felt something catch in his chest. Hannah beamed. "Perfect," she said. Stephen awkwardly stood by the front door, feeling like a stranger in his own home. "Where should we work?" Hannah asked, standing up. Stephen pointed toward the spacious living room. "This is fine." Hannah nodded and sat cross-legged on the floor, pulling out a few more cards, a small whiteboard, and a set of brightly colored markers. Oliver moved closer, curiosity clear on his face. Over the next hour, Hannah worked with Oliver, showing him simple signs combined with pictures and sounds. She spoke slowly and clearly, never raising her voice, never rushing him. She clapped and quietly cheered every time he did something right. Stephen watched from the kitchen doorway, his heart full of emotion. Oliver responded in a way Stephen had never seen before. He pointed, nodded, even tried to imitate sounds, his small face scrunched up in concentration. At one point, Hannah drew a simple house on the whiteboard and signed house. Oliver touched the drawing twice, then looked up at her and smiled. Stephen felt a slight sting behind his eyes and blinked it away. He knew he should be grateful, and he really was. But along with that gratitude came a sharp, unexpected jealousy. For so long, it had just been him and Oliver against the world. They had their own awkward rhythm, their own silent language. Now, this woman, a stranger, was breaking down walls he had never managed to tear down. Stephen swallowed hard, forcing himself to step back and let it happen. Then something extraordinary happened. Oliver stood up, clutching the whiteboard in his small hands. He crossed the room and tugged hard on Stephen's sleeve. Stephen knelt down instinctively. Oliver held up the board, his face glowing with excitement. Stephen looked at the board, the uneven but clear letters spelling out three simple words, "I like Dad." Stephen's breath caught painfully. He looked at Oliver with eager, bright eyes and felt something inside him break and heal all at once. "You did this," he whispered. Oliver nodded proudly. Behind them, Hannah watched with a gentle smile, her heart swelling. Stephen pulled Oliver into a tight hug, burying his face in his son's hair. "Thank you," he said to Hannah over Oliver's head. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. For a few moments, the room held only the sound of breathing, the fragile, precious silence of a newly built bridge. When Oliver finally pulled away, he grabbed Hannah's hand, pulling her toward Stephen as if trying to close the circle. Stephen hesitated, then reached out and took her hand. Warm, steady, real. They stood warm, steady, real. They stood there, connected by a child who had once been trapped in his own silent world, now slowly finding his way out. Stephen realized something else then, something that filled him with both hope and fear. He needed her not just for Oliver, but for himself too. The thought scared him, but he couldn't look away. Later, after Hannah packed up and promised to come back next weekend, Stephen stood by the door watching her drive away. Oliver pressed his nose to the window, waving his little hand. Stephen smiled, but deep inside, a seed of unease had taken root. He had spent so much time being everything to Oliver: protector, teacher, voice. What if Oliver didn't need him that way anymore? What if Stephen is the one left behind? Fear whispered in his ear, dark and persistent, and he tried to hold it back. Now, all that mattered was the joy in his son's eyes. Now, all that mattered was the first time in a long while. Their world was expanding. Maybe, just maybe, there was enough room, and maybe, just maybe, there was enough room for all three of them. The following weeks passed in a gentle rhythm. Every Sunday, Hannah came to Stephen's house, her bag full of teaching supplies and her smile lighting up the whole room. Under her gentle guidance, Oliver blossomed, mastering new signs, stringing words together, laughing more freely than ever. Stephen watched it all with a strange mix of surprise and growing vulnerability. He told himself everything was okay. But the more Hannah became part of their lives, the more Stephen realized he was leaning on her, not just for Oliver's progress, but for the way she softened the sharp edges of their previously lonely world. Not everyone saw it that way. You need to be careful. Julia, Stephen's sister, warned one rainy afternoon as they sat in his kitchen. You barely know her. Stephen frowned. She's been good to Oliver. Or maybe she sees an opportunity, Julia said, slamming her cup down. Rich, lonely, a single dad, a vulnerable kid. That kind of thing happens. Stephen got angry, but said nothing. Still, her words stayed with him. Not wanting things to go that way, Julia quietly hired a private investigator when she received a short edited recording of Hannah talking to a coworker about Stephen's money and wealth. Julia felt justified. Without hesitation, she forwarded it to Stephen that night. Stephen listened to it alone in his office, the room swallowed by darkness. He is rich. If I play this right, maybe I won't have to worry about money ever again. The words echoed in his ears. Cold and filled with guilt, Stephen sat frozen, disbelief fighting the pain in his heart. Was it all just a lie? The laughter, the way Oliver lit up around her the next Sunday. Stephen waited by the window, arms tightly crossed. When Hannah's car rolled into the driveway, Oliver shouted, running to the door. Stephen stayed frozen in place. When Hannah came inside, her face lit up seeing Oliver. Hey, little man, she called, ruffling the boy's hair. Stephen's voice cut through the room. We need to talk. Hannah blinked, surprised. Okay, she said, setting her bag down. Stephen quickly crossed the room and grabbed his phone. He pressed play. The distorted, cruel version of Hannah's voice filled the space. Hannah's face turned pale. Where did you get that? She whispered. Does it matter? Stephen shouted. Was any of it real, or was it all just for money? Oliver stood between them, sensing the tension. No, Hannah said, shaking her head, desperation rising. Stephen, it's not what you think. Then what is it? Stephen asked. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you used my son to get to me. Tears welled in Hannah's eyes. You think I'd use Oliver? She choked out. You think I could do that? I think you should leave, Stephen said coldly. Oliver whimpered, clutching Hannah's sleeve, looking confused. Hannah knelt down, her voice breaking. You're so brave, little one. Never forget that. She kissed the top of his head, then stood, hands trembling, facing Stephen. She said softly, I thought you were different, but you're just another man who only sees what he's scared to see. Without waiting for a reply, Hannah grabbed her bag and ran off into the gray afternoon. Stephen stood frozen, phone still in hand. Oliver whimpered again, tugging hard on Stephen's pant leg. Duh, he whispered, his voice filled with confusion and pain. Stephen knelt down and picked the boy up, but Oliver struggled, running to the door, pressing his small hands against the glass, staring down the empty driveway. Stephen fell backward, paralyzed. The house felt unbearably empty. He told himself he had protected his son, protected their fragile world, but deep inside, a painful truth tormented him. He had made a terrible mistake that couldn't be undone. The days that followed were darker than any Stephen Brooks had ever known. Oliver barely spoke, even though he had mastered some signs. He no longer reached for toys, no longer smiled at the cartoons flickering on the TV screen. He sat by the window almost all day, clutching an old napkin with a drawing of him and Hannah, staring outside as if hoping she might still appear. Stephen tried everything: favorite meals, trips to the park, new toys. Locked behind walls even higher, but Oliver kept his distance, trapped behind walls even higher than before. At night, Stephen sat sleepless, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the look on Hannah's face as she walked away, the pain. And in that moment, it wasn't anger, it was pain. And in the moment, Stephen found the courage to face it. He knew it wasn't just her hurting, but Oliver too. One afternoon, as rain tapped against the window, Stephen sat at his desk, absent-mindedly scrolling through emails he couldn't focus on. His sister, Julia, had sent another message titled "More Info on Hannah." Stephen sighed and opened it. Attached was a link to a longer audio file, the original unedited recording. For a long time, Stephen just stared at the screen. Then, trembling, he pressed play. Hannah's voice filled the room again, but this time the entire conversation was different. "So, how's the new job?" the coworker asked, a teasing tone in his voice. "It's not a show," Hannah said, her voice firm but tired. "It's just this kid. He's amazing. I don't even know if I'm really helping him. But when he smiles at me," she fell silent, emotion thickening her words. "It feels like maybe I'm doing something right for once." And the dad, the coworker, teased. Hannah chuckled softly. "He's complicated, but he loves that kid more than anything. I wouldn't mess with that trust no matter how much money's in the world." The coworker laughed again. "Still pretty great that he's rich." "Right." Hannah's reply was quick and sharp. "Money doesn't fix anything. Not what he's going through. Not what that kid needs." Stephen sat frozen, the blood draining from his face. Those words echoed in his ears, wiping away every ugly assumption he had let take root. He hadn't just doubted Hannah. He had betrayed her. He had betrayed Oliver. Stephen pushed his chair back roughly and paced the room like a trapped animal. His hands shook with anger at himself, at Julia, and at how he let fear control his trust. He thought of Oliver's tiny hands tugging on Hannah's sleeve, the first time Oliver smiled without being prompted, the way he signed his friends' names with awkward pride. All of it was gone now because of him. Stephen rubbed his face, sinking into his chair as a heavy, unavoidable guilt pressed down on his chest. In trying to protect his son, he'd broken the first real connection Oliver had ever built outside their small, isolated world, and Oliver knew. He knew something had been broken. That night, Stephen tried to coax Oliver to eat, but the boy just shook his head and turned away. Stephen knelt beside him, feeling helpless. "I'm sorry, buddy," he whispered. "I'm really sorry. Oliver, I'm really sorry." Oliver didn't respond. He just clutched the crumpled napkin tighter to his chest. Stephen slumped against the wall, his head in his hands. For the first time in years, he cried, not the silent, hidden tears he lets fall when no one is watching. The sobs that choke him are what really make him feel pain and emptiness. He cries for his son. He cries for the woman he hurt. And he cries for the man he's become, a man too scared to believe in goodness when it's freely given. When the tears finally stop, he wipes his face and looks at Oliver. The boy looks at him with a serious, steady gaze. Stephen nods slowly. "I'm going to fix this," he promises. "I will bring her back." Oliver tilts his head slightly, a spark of hope lighting up his eyes. That's the only answer Stephen needs. The next morning, Stephen makes the calls he should have made weeks ago. He confronts Julia angrily and without mercy, forcing her to admit to her manipulations. She apologizes, but the words mean nothing. This isn't something he can fix with just an apology. It's something he has to earn back. Stephen packs a small bag with just the essentials, then buckles Oliver into the back seat. As he drives out of the driveway, he feels something he hasn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. He doesn't know exactly where Hannah is, but he'll check every diner, every coffee shop, every roadside motel if he has to, because she's not the only one Oliver needs. She's the one they both need, and this time, he won't let fear steal that chance away. Stephen drives for hours, the outside world blurring past cracked asphalt roads stretching endlessly and faded neon signs. He stops at every roadside diner, every rundown motel, asking the same question: have you seen her? Tall, brown hair, gentle smile. Most shake their heads. Some don't even bother to look up. Oliver sits quietly in the back seat, gripping an old napkin tight. His presence steadies Stephen, reminding him why he can't give up, even when exhaustion claws at him. As night falls, they enter a small, quiet town off the highway, the main street lined with flickering street lamps. Stephen scans the shops until his eyes settle on an old bakery, Maggie's Cakes, the windows fogged with steam. Through the glass, he catches a glimpse of a woman wearing a flowered apron. His heart pounds in his ribs. That's her. Without thinking, he pulls over, grabs Oliver's hand, and pushes open the bakery door. The bell above jingles weakly. The warm scent of cinnamon and sugar surrounds them, but Stephen barely notices. Hannah looks up, stunned to see them. A tray slips slightly from her hands. Before Stephen can say a word, Oliver lets go and runs across the room. Arms wide open. "Home," he shouts clearly and confidently. Hannah gasps, dropping the tray to the floor. She kneels down, spreading her arms wide, and Oliver rushes into her embrace. Tears run down her cheeks as she holds him tight. Stephen stands still like a statue, all his bottled-up emotions rushing over him. Hannah pulls back slightly, cupping Oliver's face. "You kept your promise," she whispers, voice trembling. Oliver nods seriously, burying his face in her shoulder. When Hannah looks up, her eyes meet Stephen's. No words are needed. Everything is said in the forgiveness and love shining between them. Stephen takes 3 long steps across the bakery, kneels beside them, and his hand touches Hannah's as he strokes Oliver's hair. She doesn't pull away. Instead, she smiles a raw, breathtaking smile, and in that moment, Stephen knows he can't lose her again. The words come out without thinking. "Marry me," he says. Hoarse. Right here. Right now. No grand speech. No second chances. "Marry me." Hannah blinks, stunned, holding Oliver's hand tightly, tears sparkling in her eyes. "Stephen," she sighs. "I know I'm not perfect," he says hoarsely. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me. To him. To both of us. But you're the best thing that ever happened to me." A joyful laugh mixed with a broken chuckle escapes her. "To him. To both of us." A joyful laugh mixed with a broken chuckle escapes her. She wipes her cheek. "You don't even have a ring," she teases, her voice shaking. Her in his arms as Oliver squeezes between them. Giggling outside, the rain falls softly, blurring the town into a watercolor dream. Finally, Maggie, the bakery owner. "Will you sell us a cake or something else?" His face. "2 cakes, he says. "The biggest you have." Maggie giggles and disappears into the kitchen, humming. Hannah leans into Stephen, her head resting on his shoulder. Oliver snuggles warmly between them. Stephen kisses her forehead, feeling her sigh next to him. This is it. Not the life he once imagined, not the life he clung to out of fear, but something better, something real, something worth it. As he sits there, surrounded by the 2 people he loves most, Stephen realizes one simple, honest truth. Home isn't a place, it's a feeling. And finally, he had found it. Spring gently spread across the countryside, decorating the hills with wildflowers and painting the sky with endless blue. Nestled among the fields was a small farm, a freshly painted white fence, a porch slightly sagging under the weight of new beginnings. Stephen Brooks stood on the porch, a cup of coffee warming his hands, watching the morning unfold. Inside, laughter echoed, a sound once strange to him, now the rhythm of his life. Hannah had turned the old barn into something beautiful, a center for children like Oliver, named Hope Haven. Parents had come from everywhere, drawn by stories of miracles. They never knew that Stephen was the silent benefactor who bought the land and paid all the bills. This was Hannah's dream come true, and he was happy to stay behind the scenes. Oliver was thriving here. The shy boy hiding in the corner was gone. Now he ran freely through the fields, his laughter echoing in the wind, talking more with each passing day. Today wasn't about therapy or rehabilitation. Today was about family. The wedding was simple, just as they wanted it. No big venue, no endless guest list. Just them, the land that nurtured their healing, and a few important people. Stephen nervously straightened his tie, glanced down the path and saw her. Hannah walked barefoot on the grass, a crown of wildflowers on her head, her dress fluttering in the breeze. She looked like she had just stepped out of one of Oliver's drawings. Soft, radiant, breathtaking. Oliver ran ahead, holding her hand tightly, his face glowing. Stephen's heart was so full of emotion he thought it might burst. They met under an ancient oak tree, its branches spread wide like a blessing. Maggie from the bakery, who had insisted on officiating, stood waiting, grinning over a thick, worn book. "All set," she whispered. Stephen and Hannah looked at each other. Laughter broke out between them. No words were needed. They were home. The ceremony was brief, sweet, and perfectly flawless. Oliver interrupted to hand Stephen a dandelion. The wind blew Hannah's hair. Maggie forgot half of her speech and laughed through the rest. It was perfect. When Maggie finally said, "You may kiss the bride," Stephen didn't need encouragement. He leaned in, kissed Hannah with fierce love, so strong it felt like the world was tipping beneath them. When they finally pulled apart, Oliver clapped, giggling, and then, in the silence that followed, Oliver looked up at Hannah with bright, serious eyes. "Mom," he said clearly. The world stood still. Hannah gasped, knelt down as tears streamed down her face. Oliver rushed into her arms, and Stephen collapsed beside them, wrapping both in a tangle of laughter, tears, and unstoppable love. They stayed there as the light faded and the sky darkened to a soft, velvety blue. Then, they sat on the porch swing, Oliver curled up asleep between them. They watched the twinkling stars appear in the sky. The air smelled of honeysuckle and fresh earth. Then suddenly, a shooting star streaked across the sky, burning bright and fierce in the night. Hannah took a deep breath and pointed. "Look," she whispered. Stephen followed her gaze, smiling. "A wish?" he asked softly. She shook her head, her voice full of feeling. "No," she said. "A promise." Stephen tightened his arm around her and kissed her temple. "Whatever comes," he murmured. "No matter how stormy it gets, we hold on to this." "This," Hannah repeated, running her hand through Oliver's hair. "Our messy, beautiful, imperfect family." Stephen closed his eyes and felt that truth sink deep into his bones. They were lost. They had been broken. They had almost given up. But true, enduring, imperfect love had brought them back together in a way he never dared to dream of. He looked down at the two people he loved most, their faces glowing under the gentle starlight. This story reminds us that sometimes, the smallest moments, an unexpected encounter, a quiet act of kindness, a few words spoken at just the right time can change the course of someone's life. It's a powerful reminder that behind every tired smile or guarded glance is a story waiting to be seen, heard, and understood. If you found yourself moved by the journey of our main character, please consider leaving a message of support in the comments. What would you say to them if you could? What encouragement or advice would you offer as they take their next steps? Whether it's a word of hope or a suggestion for the future, your voice matters. And if this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to Touching Tales Hub. Here, we share more than just stories. We create a space for healing, reflection, and human connection. Because sometimes, all it takes is one story to help someone feel less alone. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button, join our growing community, and stay tuned for more heartwarming stories that just might change the way you see the world.